I scroll through my Instagram feed and watch mothers torn from their children and see citizens shot with pepper balls for peacefully protesting. And I feel so much anger and sadness, and my pulse quickens. And I think, how can anyone possibly see this and still support it? And I want to call my Trump loving parents and say, have you seen this? I want to ask them, right? But I know the answer. They haven't seen it, and they've been taught to distrust it even if they do. If democracy requires us to engage with one another, if it requires us to persuade one another, we need to have some semblance of shared truth. But the question is, where will it come from? And that's what we're trying to figure out with this program. I'm John Zieger. I've spent decades in the technology industry. Started working in my career working on Amazon's IPO. I worked at Microsoft for a decade on consumer products and search. I was one of the first employees at a company called Stripe. I've been
Little company called Stripe.
around, yeah, I've been in and around technology companies for decades, and I'm obsessed with the problem of the ways the technology has divided us from one another.
And I'm Lisa Senecal. Welcome to Signal Fire. Um, I come out of politics and independent media. I've been had been for the past several years running Lincoln Square Media and working in the pro-democracy space and kind of struggling in real time with exactly the kind of stuff that John's talking about, both on a professional basis and personally. I think all of us know that feeling that we are now so separated from people we care about and communities that we care about because we are living in information bubbles that are so incredibly difficult to pierce so that we can have even a bit of shared information to start having the conversations that we all need to be having. Because at this point, we're living in a world that has a surplus of information, but a scarcity of truth. So I'm really excited that we're going to be having these conversations every week with people who are working in all different fields to try to grapple with what's happening and how we find our way out.
Yeah, Lisa, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because it wasn't always this way, right? That sense of disconnection that we have. I think we have come to take it for granted as just a fact of our reality. Maybe not the best analogy, but I think about this like gravity in some ways. It's like it literally, we could not exist for 1 second without gravity in the universe. It's a thing we refer to all the time. And yet it is a thing that is incredibly poorly understood. I mean, basically, even by the people who spend their lifetimes studying it, it's a humongous phenomenon. And I think in a way, this thing that we're starting to try to describe here is a similar phenomenon, right? We once, as Americans, as citizens in the world, because it's not just an American phenomenon, lived in an information universe that was coherent, right? Where we could, even if we disagreed on facts, we had some sense of a shared reality. But that's just no longer true. And of course, we're on the verge of AI making synthetic media look as real as anything else, right? So
Terrifying.
the phenomenon is going to, yeah, it's bad, and it's only going to get worse, right? So we,
Yeah.
in a way that's kind of analogous to gravity, this phenomenon of us not being able to communicate with one another, this kind of post Tower of Babel world that we live in. That was not always true, but it is in some sense the central fact of certainly our political reality and increasingly our social reality. And I think that's, as you say, I think for us, we're obsessed with that problem. How do we understand it? How do we understand where it came from? How do we find the antecedents of it? Where what are the times when it did work? When did it start to break? How did that fissure widen? And how do we find ourselves where we are now? And most importantly, and what we hope, I think, as we've talked about this, to spend most of our time on is how does it get better? What does it look like to get better in terms of new technologies, in terms of new businesses, in terms of new practices? Because I think probably the answer sits in all of those spaces. And that's what we're going to explore week over week here as we have these conversations.
Yeah, some of these conversations I think are going to be really interesting in that there's a generation of us, Gen X and older, who remember the before times, and then there are the younger generations who have none of that memory, that institutional memory of what
Yeah.
things used to be like when we did have limited number of information sources. So maybe we were not as well informed as we were, but I think we can make a pretty effective argument that um, having as much information as we have now has not made us better informed. But the incentive structure has changed too, right? When I was a kid and a young adult, and we had these few information sources. We all sat down and watched one of three different evening news. We
Hmm.
read the same newspapers largely. There was an incentive for media to be credible, right? We had real trust in the people who were delivering the news to us. That's not the incentive structure anymore for the media. Now it's eyeballs. It's an attention economy. So how do you think that that has really changed um, how we function as consumers and our ability to have an impact on what we are being served up?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, right? Chris Hayes has a great book out in the last 6 months or so about the attention economy. I mean, there's certainly been lots and lots written about it, and I think that again, it's one of these phenomena that the closer you look at it, the more you sort of see it everywhere. The reality is, it's not just traditional media or cable news or even social media. It's really every element of the economy has become focused on attention as a commodity. In many ways, it's the most valuable commodity, right? Why does the richest man in the world choose to buy one of the most important media platforms in the world, right? Because attention is incredibly important. So we built an economy around accumulating attention and monetizing attention. That has, in this question of incentive structures, that has created the incentive to do anything possible to keep our attention. And there's that line about the brightest minds of our generation being spent to get people, to get people to click on advertisements or watch, short videos, and that really is. To a substantial degree, where we are, right? We have a massive economy of tremendous assets, tremendously intelligent people and systems designed to harvest our attention. For us as human beings, that means we sit in a kind of defensive crouch relative to all of these systems, right? We're bombarded with things that are trying to steal our attention, right? You look at one video and all of a sudden you realize, you look up in a half drunken stupor and realize you spent the last hour scrolling through stuff on
Right.
on YouTube or Instagram, right? And in that world where everything competes for your attention, you need to come up with different strategies for how to sort through it, and particularly as it pertains to what we would uh, call news, although the distinction even between news and other information has become blurred. How do I find what matters to me? How do I find what's true? And people have come up with different strategies, and I think the strategy that is at the moment sort of preeminent is a kind of creator-led strategy, right?
Mhm.
It's what I do as an individual is I start to tune in to individual voices that I trust, because there's so much noise. And that has some positive aspects to it, I think, but it also has some obviously, negative aspects, which is, it's an open season on for propaganda, for all kinds of manipulation. And so, That's part of what the phenomenon I think we want to explore here is in a world where people are using different strategies, creators maybe being the preeminent one, to curate this overwhelming world for them. How do we take advantage of that in a way that is consistent with truth? How in that world can truth flourish? How can people find voices that really are not just trusted but are trustworthy? I think these are
Right.
really fundamental questions. And how do we create systems and, back to your word, incentives for those things?
I mean, unfortunately, we do not evolve as humans as quickly as technology has moved forward. And so we're still, whether we like it or not, we react to these emotional appeals. And generally, it's negative emotions that grab our attention and hold on to us longer, right? Because if we're out in the wilderness alone, we need to be very aware of where the threats are, and make sure that the saber-toothed tiger is not going to eat us. So we are going to be drawn to that the same way we're drawn to sweets because we used to
Yeah.
need the nutrients when we couldn't go 5 minutes from our homes and buy up an entire shelf of candy. So we do have the surplus of information. We are looking to creators to try to give us some way of narrowing that funnel down
Hmm.
to the information we think is valuable. We really need to constantly be questioning ourselves and why we have chosen the people we are listening to. Is it because there's an emotional reaction and we're getting dopamine hits because we're consuming that content? Or is it because we know that this is a fact-based person who we
Yeah.
can trust and we really are becoming more informed, and that the information that we then end up sharing with other people, that we aren't just becoming terrible sources of propaganda?
Mm. Right. I mean, the internet is, if it's anything, it's a bias confirmation machine. In a world where the marginal cost of producing content and distributing content that looks as good as any other content, more or less, is approaching zero. I can find literally anything I want. I can find some, large communities that will say that the earth is flat, or, the Holocaust didn't happen, or whatever. Name your thing, right?
We aren't living in an
And
authoritarian country.
yeah, and yeah, any position you would like to have espoused. And so, right. So part of the question here, I think, is, what are the practices we as individuals undertake, and frankly, even upstream of those practices, right? Before I get to practices, I have to know what my values are. Does truth even matter?
Right.
What is truth? Does truth is anything that is inconsistent with my biases, not true? Some of these questions sit in our own sort of psychology, even our own kind of spirituality at some level, right? But I think they also sit at the level of our educational system. How do we
Right.
get people to understand that truth is not entirely subjective, and there is so much work to be done kind of at every dimension of this problem that we won't I don't know that we'll explore all of it, but we'll explore a lot of it. We really want to figure out what is a system that will help us get to be able to live in this world of information surplus, and still find truth.
One of the things that we're going to need to touch on, you sort of alluded to this when you mentioned the owner of Twitter, and I am forever going to call it Twitter because for some reason that makes me feel like a radical, that I'm not going to go
Yeah,
along
right,
and call it
right.
X, which is kind of stupid, but it makes me feel better. But there are political motivations to encouraging how overwhelmed people are feeling by the propaganda, by the amount of information that's coming out, by such a steady stream of misinformation and disinformation, that we either decide we're going to take in and believe as much of that as we can, or
Hmm.
we're going to decide this is such a horrible, distasteful place to be, to consume any information related to the news is so um, personally destructive that you just become apathetic. I can't take any
Yeah.
more in. I can't see that child being ripped out of that mother's arms. I can't see another pastor be pepperballed. So that apathy and the nihilism that we see creeping in is so dangerous to our democracy, to the future that we're creating
Yeah.
for our kids. And you and I both have adult children, and we've handed off something pretty toxic at this point.
One of the people we're going to speak to in our first few episodes is the author Peter Pomerantsev, who has written a number of great books on information and information warfare. And but his first one is about sort of kind of information warfare in Putin's Russia, or the sort of the information ecosystem, and this idea of getting citizens to tune out because they can't believe anything, or they can
Right.
believe everything a little bit, is incredibly powerful and corrosive. And what it results in is people just disengaging from information, from the political system, from their neighbors in important ways, and it's super destructive. And I think, as much as not being able to talk about certain events with, let's say, my parents, or relatives that I have who are have fundamentally very different political views than I might have, what's almost more worrying to me is the phenomenon that you're talking about, right? Where I talk to friends of my, not so much my kids, who are pretty engaged in the world, but their friends often, this sense of being checked out. It's kind of all the same. They're all the same.
Hmm.
None of it matters. Is so incredibly corrosive. And as with all these things, there's some vein of truth to it. It's not a totally unreasonable thing, but it's really super corrosive. And so that's one of that phenomenon of nihilism, and the ways that it impacts young people in particular, both young men and young women, is something we'll be talking about. I think in our first episode with Cynthia Miller Idris, uh,
Yeah.
with a particular focus on young men, which I'm excited about.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have that conversation with her. She has been so deeply researching um, radicalization and extremism, and the tactics that are being deployed now ag- against our kids, particularly boys and young men online, that play into fear, play into loneliness. Play into the isolation that a lot of young people are feeling, and really taking them to some incredibly dark places. And fortunately, smart people like Cynthia Miller Idris are doing this research, and then they're creating ways to work through this and come out the other side, and testing what really does have an impact. And then we'll talk to her about the strategies that they're deploying to teach other people how to do what works. And so
Yeah.
we've talked a lot today about the problems, and I think it's really important that we set the stage of just how big um, an issue all of this is. But our future episodes are really going to be focused on what the solutions can be. This isn't a permanent state that we're in. There is a way beyond this, and we're going to talk with social scientists and creators and psychologists and um, data scientists, all sorts of folks who are doing the hard work and doing the research. And I'm excited that I think these conversations are going to be part of the solution, John.
Well, me too. I think it's a problem we've been obsessed with for a long time. I think, I'm guessing that a lot of the folks who are listening to us have also been obsessed with aspects of this, right? Because you see it, you can't miss it in your own life. every day. And so looking forward to joining you here every week as we talk to folks who are working on solutions. And we will see you back here next week.
Yep. You can find us wherever you find your podcast. And we are going to be here every week. So please do like the podcast, share it with folks. Important conversations we need to be having. So I hope we can spread them as widely as we possibly can. And thanks for joining us.
Thanks.